My name is Connie, and I'm a child of God. I guess I better turn to the first page here. I was born and raised in Stover, Missouri. I had a brother a year younger than me and a sister who's 3 years younger. My father was a functioning alcoholic. He always worked and made sure that we had what we needed. My mother worked hard inside our home, taking care of us all, but she relied on prescription drugs in order to function. My mom and dad fought constantly, trying to kill each other. I saw a lot of things that I shouldn't have seen. Sometime around the age of 9 is when I got saved. My German grandfather was a Lutheran and always listened to a Lutheran Missouri Synod program on the radio. I loved the stories on this program, and I said the sinner's prayer and meant it. In fact, I got saved every time I listened to this program. It was also about this time that I started running away from home to get away from the terror in my house. A Christian neighbor intervened and talked with my parents and eventually got them to put us into a Lutheran school, and we started attending St. Paul's Lutheran Church. I always felt like I was not good enough and didn't fit in with these people. When I was 11, I was molested by a 15-year-old boy. That began shaping the thoughts that I had about myself. My parents really did want what was best for me, and they pushed me to be friends with the good kids. Whenever I stayed at my friend's house, I noticed that they didn't live like we did. We lived a different lifestyle behind closed doors than we did to the rest of the world. And although my parents had good intentions, it just didn't work for me. Because I felt that my friends were superior to me, I found new friends that I felt superior to make myself feel better. I started drinking and experimenting with drugs. My new friends had much more freedom than I had, and my dad forbid me to hang out with them, so I became rebellious. I was running away from home again to do what I wanted to do. I didn't think it was fair because, after all, he was sitting in the bar drinking with the parents of my new friends. When I was 17, I quit school and I moved to Chicago with a man twice my age, who was also my drug dealer. We lived in a gang neighborhood in the inner city. His brothers were the leaders of this gang. I had 2 kids by this man, Brandon and Sheena, 5 years apart. He was very controlling and abusive. I wasn't allowed to even go to the store without his permission, and usually had to walk everywhere I went. He would beat me to keep me under his control. I was running away from home again, just like I had when I was a little girl, but now I had nowhere to go, and my little boy was usually with me. I have found myself in just about every situation that you can imagine at one time or another. I always went back thinking it would get better. That lifestyle had become normal to me. It was very similar to what I grew up in. Anything different was uncomfortable. The unknown is scary, and that is why so many people go back to doing what they've always done. He beat me up pretty bad several times, once with an iron skillet, which put me in the hospital. He broke my jaw in several places. I lost my eyesight for about 2 days, and my head was swelled very badly. They were going to have to wait for the swelling to go down in order to do surgery. But I left the hospital before having surgery because he sent someone in to talk to me who convinced me that the state would take my son if I stayed there. I was under protective custody in the hospital, and so was my son Brandon in pediatrics. I had surgery about 6 weeks later. He beat me up the whole time I was pregnant with Sheena, and I had her 6 weeks early. After I had Sheena, life at home began to get more difficult. It became a nightly event. The mental abuse was the worst part of it. I was starting to question my own sanity. I knew that one of us was crazy, but I just wasn't sure which one of us it was. He also had me convinced that he always knew what I was thinking, so I tried not to think at all. I actually got quite good at not thinking and not feeling. When he was hitting me, I learned to numb myself by taking my mind somewhere else. I would leave my body. He was drunk at the bar every night, and I never knew what time he would show up. When he did come home, he would tell me about all the horrible things that I had done that night while I was with him at the bar, only I wasn't with him. I was scared to sleep before he got there because so many times I had woke up sliding down the wall on the opposite side of the room. I was afraid to leave him because he told me that he would hunt me down and kill me or kill my family. I believed him because I knew that he had killed people before. He had served 7 years at the wall in Jeff City for murder before I had met him, and I knew of others that he hadn't been caught for. My brother had also come to live in Chicago. He knew what an evil person this man was, and we started making plans to kill him because I thought that would be the only way to get away from him. A few weeks later, I had such an overwhelming feeling to run. I felt an impression telling me to go now, or you're going to die. I believe that if I had not listened to that voice, I would not be here today. God put a lot of people on my path that night and the next morning that made a way for me to get out of there. I boarded a train and came back to Missouri. Brandon was 6 and Sheena was 18 months old. I had good intentions when I got back to Missouri, but my drinking and drug use became worse after I was here for a while. I believe that I suffered from post-traumatic stress for some time. After I had been back for about a year, I got another overwhelming feeling about my brother that lasted all day and grew worse. I felt like he was going to die. It was so strong that I felt like he had already died. I told my parents that we needed to get him back here or something really bad was going to happen to him. Everyone thought I was crazy, including my brother. He said that Chicago was now his home and didn't have any intention of ever coming back here. 2 weeks later, he called me and said, I think you're right. He said that he had a bad feeling and could I come get him. I sent someone to go get him out of there. After a few months of him being back home, we were talking and we both felt like he was out of danger. We discussed dying and what we had learned in school about not going to heaven when we die, but that we sleep instead. We agreed that whoever died first would contact the other, if it were somehow possible. 3 months to the day after he came home from Chicago, he died drunk in a car wreck. I woke up suddenly around 4:30 a.m. I sat up straight in bed. I sat straight up in bed and listened because I thought that the phone had rang or someone had knocked on the door, which my brother was accustomed to doing in the middle of the night. I couldn't figure out what had woke me up, and I couldn't go back to sleep. I later learned that the car he was in went off the road and flipped, and he went through the back window. He laid in the highway with a broken neck for about an hour before the ambulance got there. He died on the way to Lake Ozark Hospital about the same time I woke up. He was 25 years old. I had a very hard time dealing with his death and did not deal with it at all until I got into a recovery program 7 years later. After several relationships, I got married. My son did not want me to marry this man, and he didn't like Brandon either. That should have been a good indication for me to not marry him, but I did anyway. Brandon never told me until a few years ago that he had put a gun to Brandon's head and threatened him on several occasions. Not long after we were married, I hit bottom with using drugs and drinking. I began going to AA meetings and was happy and quite satisfied with my life because I was not drinking and I wasn't using any hard drugs anymore. I was still smoking marijuana, though, and had no intention of ever stopping. I was one of those people that said when I'm old, I would be sitting in a rocking chair on the porch smoking a joint. I would smoke till I died. I loved it and always said there isn't anything wrong with it. I don't have a problem with it. I can quit anytime I want to. I just don't want to. I know today God gave me this for somebody, I believe, in here. He gave this to me the other night. Anything that I use or rely on to change the way that I am feeling or to help me to get through something other than God is a problem. I tried to work the 12 steps in that program, but could only go so far because as long as I was still getting high, I was not turning my will and my life totally over to God. My life seemed to be going back downhill, and I was soon desperate again. My husband had gotten drunk the night before, and he wasn't sure what he had done. He thought that he may have shot someone. I went to the bathroom, locked the door, and fell to my knees, and I asked God, what is the problem here? My life is supposed to be better. I heard a voice inside me very clearly say, give up the pot and your life will get better. I did that January 2nd, 1993, and I now have 24 years clean from marijuana. And I have 25 years from all other drugs and alcohol. I started building a relationship with Jesus like never before, and the fog started lifting off my life, and I was seeing what a mess it truly was. My son was acting crazy. He was walking on ledges trying to scare me. He was 11 when I quit using drugs. I had had him in counseling for several years because I thought that he had a problem, not me. I even told him not to talk about what goes on in our house. I never thought that I was his problem. He was acting out even more now, and I was forced to make a decision. I had to sign him into a mental hospital in Columbia. I lied to him to get him there, and he got very upset with me when I admitted him. Whenever I would go to visit him, he spent the whole time begging me to get him out of there, and he promised he would be good if I would just please take him home. I couldn't take him out of there because I had to sign him over to the state because I couldn't pay for the treatment. I had to pry his hands and arms from me and run out of the hospital. I was in my first year clean, and I almost relapsed over that incident. His doctor was pretty convinced that his symptoms and behaviors were due to sexual molestation. That was the last thing that I had considered and had no idea who it would be. He refused to talk and cooperate with the doctor, and after 30 days, he came home. I continued in my recovery and soon moved from Stover to Sedalia. I had my kids in the same Lutheran school I went to in Stover and transferred them to the Lutheran school here. I worked steps in the Narcotics Anonymous program here in Sedalia, and I helped a lot of other women work steps and get their life back together. My husband had quit using drugs in the beginning just out of support for me, but then started again and hid it from me for a long time. When I found out, I asked him to leave. I got into a couple more relationships with guys in the NA program and was not living the kind of lifestyle that I would want my kids to live. I had substituted meetings for drugs at first because I was always going to meetings, and then I was substituting men for drugs. I know today that my addiction was never my problem. They were the symptoms of my problem. My problem was that I didn't have a relationship with Jesus, so I didn't know who I was. I was filling that void with everything else that only He can fill. Even though I was no longer using drugs, I was still putting myself first ahead of my kids. I took Sheena to meetings with me, and it became her second home. She had all the literature memorized, and she practically knew as much as I did about recovery and Narcotics Anonymous. I was still having some problems with Brandon, though. He was angry and would become violent with me. He learned this behavior from me while he was growing up because I was violent. But he was becoming bigger than me, and I was becoming scared of him. I was running some errands one day, getting ready to leave town, when I had another one of those moments where I felt an overwhelming urge to go home first. I was just a few weeks from celebrating 4 years clean when I walked into my house and caught my son molesting my daughter. After I got her out of the house and confronted him, I learned that he had been molested by a male friend of mine for several years while I was still using. And he was trying to get even with me because he felt like I knew and had allowed it. I had to make a tough decision. I had to protect one of my kids from the other, so I had to have him picked up. He spent 13 months in a boys' reform school, and Sheena ended up spending 30 days in a mental hospital for depression. She couldn't understand why her brother hated her so much. Brandon completed the treatment program and rebuilt a relationship with his sister before returning home. Sheena refused to talk about it and felt that it would never affect her life. Sheena was 7 years old when I got clean, and when she was older, she said that she never remembered that part of our life when I was using. She was always very quiet, and she wanted to be like her mom. When she was 6, she rolled a perfect joint from cigarette tobacco and presented it to me, very proud of herself. She had watched me and wanted to impress me. I didn't know what to say to her. I realized then that my kids were learning by what I do, not by what I was telling them. Sheena was deeply hurt when I told her that her stepfather and I had split up and he would not be coming back. She cried in her room for months. She considered him to be her dad. They really loved each other. It just wasn't that way with Brandon. He died a few years later from cancer in a VA hospital in Idaho. I talked to him on the phone a couple weeks before he slipped into a coma, and he had accepted Jesus. When Sheena was 14, I moved another guy in, and I had Tiara and Tyler, who are now 18 and 14. When Tiara was very young, I started having problems with Sheena. The new boyfriend was very strict and unreasonable. She started running away from home. She was hanging out with friends that I didn't approve of. She was drinking and partying with boys, and I lost custody of her for a year because of her running away. About a year after she came back home, I had a disagreement with my boyfriend, and he kicked me out. A year later, I moved back, and Sheena decided to quit school and get her own apartment, which became the party house in Sedalia. She ended up losing her job and apartment, came back for a little while, and then went to stay with her brother and his wife. When she was 19, she had a little boy named Dante, and while she was pregnant, we became the best of friends, in spite of all the problems that we had had in the past. When she was still in her apartment, I had one of those impressions again. I went by her job during her break, and I blatantly accused her of using methamphetamine. I never knew of her doing it before, and I had never accused her of something like that before. Of course, she denied it at the time, but now she was confessing that she couldn't figure out how I knew that, especially since it was the very first time that she ever had. She said that she was glad that that part of her life was over because she had big plans for her life. She was proud of me for getting my GED and going to college, and I had just opened my own business. She also wanted to go to college, and she received her GED 2 weeks before she had the baby. She was so happy that she was having a baby and was never going to use drugs again. She wanted to get married, but she was having problems with her boyfriend because he was using pretty heavily. After she had the baby, we were talking again about her life. I told her about all the times I had worried about her when I didn't know where she was and if she was okay. I told her that I was always afraid that I would get that phone call that she was being taken to the hospital or dead. She told me that she always thought that she wouldn't live to see 20, but she thought that she was going to be okay now. About 2 months later, on a Saturday evening, I got a phone call that she was being taken to the hospital because of a methamphetamine overdose. I prayed all the way there, and I knew she was going to be all right. I told God this would be a real wake-up call for her, and I know that she will never do this again. When I got to the hospital, a nurse came out to tell me that she was not going to live. At first, no one knew how she got there or what happened. After an investigation, we learned that she was on a 20-hour hold at the jail. She was with a guy she shouldn't have been with and was hiding a coffee filter on her body for him that had been used to make meth. I'm sure that she didn't know that it would absorb into her skin. I don't know if she ever figured it out. She screamed and rolled around on the floor of the jail begging to be taken to the hospital for almost an hour when she went into seizures. Her temperature was 105 when she got to the hospital, and they revived her several times. After 4 hours in the emergency room, she was moved to CCU. She died the next day, June 5th, 2005. She was 20 years old. Brandon told me that 5 days before Sheena died, she had confided in him that she needed some help. She had started using meth again because she was frustrated with her boyfriend using, that she gave in to it. She finally also realized that the abuse from him was affecting her and her relationships with other people because she had not dealt with it. They talked for hours, and he was going to help her get help. Sheena went into a coma after she arrived at the hospital. She never moved or showed any emotion, except sometimes when people would talk to her, tears would come down her cheeks. Our pastor from the Lutheran church was there, and he read the story to her of Peter walking on the water. He told Sheena to take Jesus' hand and step out of the boat. She closed her hand around his hand, and tears came out of her eyes. I believe that God did this so that I would know that she was with him. She later raised her arm in the air like she was reaching, and she took her last breath. A few years after her death, Brandon was sentenced to 4 years in prison. I was just devastated, and it forced me to take a good look at my life. I was unhappy and decided to do something about it. I told God that I wanted to know who he was, and I wanted everything that he had for me. I asked him to reveal himself to me, tell me what to do and how to do it. I started looking for him everywhere. I saw a flyer for Life After Meth, and I went alone because I couldn't get anyone to go with me. That's how I learned about Celebrate Recovery. Since I had been in recovery before, I started going to meetings and decided to invest 1 year of my life in a step study. I suggested it to my boyfriend since recovery is where we had met, but he wasn't interested, and I told him that things were going to have to change in our house. I told him that we were going to have to work some things out and get married, or I was going to leave after that year. He thought that was funny and didn't see anything that needed to be worked out. I decided that I was going to live for God and not just talk about it. God opened my eyes about the relationship I was in and had been in for 12 years. I was being controlled with intimidation. I thought that because we had 2 kids together, we needed to stay together. I felt God whisper in my ear, "You're not married." It was not his will for me to live with someone that I was not married to, and it's not his will for me to marry someone that does not want to live for him. That year was very difficult, but God cheered me on. I wanted to give in and give up. This man showed his true colors. It was uncomfortable. I knew that if I just said the word, he would quit being mean to me and everything would be really good for a while, but I felt that nudging of the Holy Spirit to keep going. I learned that if someone says they are a Christian, the action should follow. I'm glad that my kids have a good relationship with their father, and he is a good father. The kids see how he lives his life without God, but I'm trying to show them how to live for God and how people have to treat me to be in my life and how to treat others. I say a lot of things to my kids about God and my life, I say a lot of things to my kids about God and living right, but now I try to live it so they can see it. Proverbs 22:6 says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." I heard someone say once that to train means to show by example. I left that relationship and lived alone, raising my last 2 kids. Tiara was 11 and Tyler was 7. When Tiara was 14, she decided that she wanted to live with her dad and new stepmom to go to school in Marshall. I felt like another one of my kids had just died. Although she promised to come home on weekends, I didn't see her much. I missed out on her high school years. After a few years, I realized that I didn't know her at all. She was living a lifestyle that I would never have believed. She came back to live with me a year ago, just at this time a year ago in October. And I was so happy that she was going to finish out her senior year in my house. But that only lasted 4 months because I had to kick her out because she wouldn't follow my rules. She's 18 now, living on her own, and I'm really scared for her. I'm back in a step study trying to let God show me how to trust him. We are peeled like onions in recovery, and new flaws in our character are revealed. I have a very controlling nature, and I'm working on that now. I try to set the stage with my plans on what my kids' lives should look like in case they die tomorrow, and it's killing me. I have been raising kids for almost 40 years. I have Tyler left at home, and he's 14. I'm praying for smooth sailing. I did get married a year and a half ago to a man of God, so I'm excited to see what God has planned for our future. Sheena chose a song for her funeral when she was 13. She wanted me to listen to this song, but I was always too busy, and I never did. I did remember the name of it, so Brandon knew what it was, so we were able to play it at her funeral. I wish that I had listened to it while she was still alive because it says a lot about what she was feeling. I couldn't understand why she died, and I didn't. I've been close to death many times. I've had illnesses and many car wrecks that I should have died from. I've done a whole lot more drugs and worse ones than she ever did. I used to ask why, but I know that God works all things together for good to those who love him, Romans 8:28. Because of her death, I sought after God more than ever before in my life. If I hadn't, I wouldn't be standing here today. So I like to honor her with my testimony for that reason. So her song is going to be played in a moment. I want to close with a scripture that God gave me many years ago when I wrote my first testimony, and it's Psalm 41-3. I waited patiently on the Lord to help me, and he turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on solid ground and steadied me as I walked along. He has given me a new song to sing, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see what he has done and be astounded, and they will put their trust in the Lord. Thank you.
Spend all your time waiting for that second chance, for a break that would make it okay. There's always some reason to feel not good enough, and it's hard at the end of the day. I need some distraction. Oh, beautiful release. Memories seep from my veins. Let me be empty. Oh, and weightless, and maybe I'll find some peace tonight in the arms of the angel. Fly away from here, from this dark, cold hotel room and the endlessness that you fear. You are pulled from the wreckage of your silent reverie. You're in the arms of the angel. May you find some comfort here. So tired of the straight line, and everywhere you turn, there's vultures and thieves at your back. The storm keeps on twisting. You keep on building the lies that you make up for all that you lack. It don't make no difference. Escape one last time. It's easier to believe in this sweet madness, all this glorious sadness that brings me to my knees. In the arms of the angel, fly away from here, from this dark, cold hotel room and the endlessness that you fear. You are pulled from the wreckage of your silent reverie. You're in the arms of the angel. May you find some comfort here. You're in the arms of the angel. May you find some